What's up, everybody? It's Pastor PJ Arsold with another episode of About That. Now, this week's topic I want to talk about is that of anger. Anger is something that is prevalent. It's all over the place. That's not new. I'm not the first person to observe this. Often it is done and celebrated and encouraged in the effort to make change happen, because typically when we are angry, that can spur on action. And so anger is something that we like when people who think like us get angry about things that we also don't like. We champion that, we celebrate that. And anger is something that we all experience due to a variety of factors. We experience anger when we have an issue with somebody, they say something that hurts us, or they do something that frustrates us. We experience anger when our favorite sports team loses, or when something is happening in the world that we don't like. We get angry. And the question then for us that I want to reflect on is, should Christians get angry too? Is there a place in the Christian life for a right kind of anger? And if so, what? Or should Christians reevaluate how they handle such an emotion? So that's what I want to talk to you a little bit about today. Now, like I said, anger is an emotion, like happiness, sadness. It's at its core a reaction to something that, for whatever reason, we find displeasurable, we find bad. So the world, like I said, sometimes can celebrate anger. We like when people yell, right? Speak truth to power. We like when people get angry about the ways that society is corrupting kids or whatever it might be. We can get very angry. And in our own life too, when there's somebody who does something to us, we feel justified in getting angry at them because they have sinned against us. They have wronged us. And so what I want to look at a little bit is just reflect on what Scripture, what the Bible has to say to Christians about anger. Because if you look at Scripture, anger and wrath come up a lot. They're very common themes. But one of the interesting things is that throughout Scripture, when you look at anger and wrath, one of the most common places you see it is actually in reference to God. Which is crazy, because we know that God is love, to follow the words of John. And so the question is, how is anger and wrath associated with God? Well, what we see throughout, especially if you look at the Old Testament, but it's also very prevalent in the New Testament, in Paul's letters and such, and even Jesus' words, is that God has wrath and anger against sin, against evil, against a rejection of Him. Not in some petty way, but God made this world good and right and loving. And anything that undermines that, anything that causes pain and suffering and separation from God, who is the giver of all life, is evil and sinful, and that angers God. Now, even while we talk about God being having anger and wrath at times, and again, this is something you'll see if you read the Scripture, it's hard to miss because it's very common. God's wrath depicted, God being angry at His people. At the same time, Scripture refers to Him, and God even refers to Himself as one who is gracious and loving, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. And so, first off, as somebody pointed out in an article, that should tell you how bad God's people have been at times. When the God who is slow to anger frequently gets angry with His people, it's not that frequently because He's super like, oh, I'm so moody. It's because the people continue to rebel and He's forgiving and loving. But again, the anger, the wrath of God is in response to sin. It's in response to the separation from Him. It's in the response to what is undermining His good creation, the results of this fall. And so God is depicted as sometimes getting angry, and His wrath is a common theme in Scripture. And even His Son Jesus then at times displays what we might call anger. The most common example, and this is often something Christians will point to when reflecting on the topic of anger, is Jesus in the temple precincts. When He drives out the money changers, He says, you have taken this house of prayer and turned it into a den of thieves, right? Because what they are doing is they're taking this temple where you're supposed to experience God's presence, and instead they're using it for their own profit, to take advantage of those who have come in, and they sell animals and all of that. So Jesus flips tables over, He makes a whip, and He drives them out of it, right? And so He displays this anger towards them. And that's often one thing that is pointed to too. All right, so God can be angry, so Jesus can be angry, and so clearly there's a place for Christians to be angry, right? And that's where we have to pause, because, newsflash, God and Jesus are a little different than you and me. God and Jesus cannot sin. They cannot do wrong. Right? And we said that anger is in response to, like, God's anger, and that would include Jesus' anger too, is in response to sin, to response to evil. And so it is this anger that is opposed to those things that are cutting people off from God, that are hurting, that are promoting oppression, injustice, wrongdoing. And so there's this anger that flows out of that from God and Jesus to push away and to repel those things that are hurting this creation and hurting people. The hard thing is that you and I, unlike God and Jesus, are with sin. We cannot go even a day without sinning in some way against God and against other people. It is part of the curse. And God is continuing to renew us day by day and to conform us more to the image of His Son. But in this lifetime, we are still fallen. And what's interesting is if you look at Scripture, like I said, one of the most predominant themes is that God can get angry with His people and the wrath of God upon sin. And yet whenever you look at anger in relation to humans, it is almost always with a very negative sense. Sometimes straight up outright. Like if you look at the Proverbs, anger pops up a ton in the Proverbs. And those are wisdom literature. These are supposed to help people live godly, good, righteous lives. And anger is commonly associated with being a fool. It's associated with stirring up challenges and issues. It's never spoken of in a good sense. You look at people like Cain and Abel. So Cain is getting angry at Abel because God has taken his gift and looked upon it favorably, where He doesn't look upon Cain's gift the same way. And God says, "Why are you angry?" and goes on to say that sin is crouching at the door, that sin is going to get you. So there's something about humans that anger naturally flows and tends itself towards sin. Now, this does not mean that to experience the emotion of anger is inherently sinful. That would be more than Scripture says. However, anytime we experience anger, it should set off every alarm in our mind and our body. Holy cow, look out, because I am in grave danger of sinning right now. I'm in grave danger of doing something that I will regret, something that God does not want me to do. Sin and anger are so closely tied in Scripture that sometimes Paul, when he's listing sins, he'll just list anger. He'll just say, put away therefore like gossip and malice and deceit, wrathfulness and anger. Just as if like those are just, they're so tied to sin that to hold on to those, to dwell in those, to live in those, is playing with fire. There really is no place in a Christian life to live in a state of anger. And this is challenging, this is hard. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount says anyone who hates his brother has committed murder. So anyone who hates somebody and has like kind of this anger towards them, it's murder against that person. And so Christians, at all costs, should avoid anger. It's not something that we are called to do. And one of the comforting things is that we're told that vengeance, paying people back for their wrongdoings, even if they're against us, is not for us to take into our own hands. That when somebody hurts me, when somebody attacks me, somebody says something or does something that frustrates me, I don't need to pay them back. I mean, that's when we feel sometimes the most justified, is when somebody does something and then we hurt them back. And it could be just a word that we say out of anger, but we feel justified in it because they started it, right? They hurt us, and so they deserve what they have coming to them. And yet Scripture says, ultimately, vengeance is in God's hands. We trust that at the end of the age, He will deal with injustice and wrongdoing and those who have rejected Him according to His will. But I don't need to deal with that. And so instead, we are people of peace, people of gentleness, of kindness. That means we still sometimes speak a strong word. It's not to say that we just roll over and do nothing, but we have to be very careful because Christians often justify our actions in terms of righteous anger. One of the best resources if you want to read more kind of an in-depth look at Scripture on this is if you Google The Myth of Righteous Anger by Jeffrey Gibbs. It's a great article where he just looks at the Bible, and especially the New Testament, and what it has to say about anger in the Christian's life. But the long and short of it is that anger is something that, while it can stir up action in us, it almost always is a negative action. There's a reason that we call it blind rage. It's because anger is such a powerful emotion that we lose all ability for rationality and reason. We lose all compassion usually. And all of a sudden we just become a destructive force. And so anger is something that Christians should always be on alert for. If you find yourself angry, it's one of those we need to ask God to help us with it. It can also be too, I realize people's disposition is different, circumstances are different. So having somebody that you can talk through, why am I angry? Is there another way to handle this? Because again, it's not to say that just I experienced the emotion of anger and now, oh, I'm so bad. But we don't want to sit there and we don't want to justify our actions because we are angry. And it can be really easy just to label it as righteous anger. But the Christian way is one of non-retaliation. It is one of love. And again, sometimes that love can be firm, but it is not angry. Sometimes that love is strong and sharp, but it's done out of love and compassion. And while anger can stir up action, Jeffrey Gibbs, in that article I recommended, he talks about that we should ask ourselves as Christians, if it takes being angry to do something, to take action on behalf of a neighbor, then we should ask ourselves, why is compassion and mercy and love for them not enough? And we should ask God to stir up in our hearts action and care so that way we don't need to be angry in order to do something to help others. So the long and short is anger is dangerous. Be very careful. And wherever anger is, sin is crouching at the door. It is right there. And so we should always be on alert. We should always look to diffuse anger, to bring down those emotions, to let reason and love and compassion prevail. Again, sometimes we're going to experience the emotion of anger, and that's where we find ways to deal with it, whether it is talking through with a loved one, whether it's seeking more extensive counseling or something, if that's something you're prone to, that this is a long-term struggle. But we're not an angry people. We're a loving people who take action. We're a loving people who are not apathetic, but we also realize that we are very prone to sin, and there are very few emotions that lead to sin as frequently and as commonly as anger. And so whenever we experience anger, whenever we find ourselves angry at somebody or something, we should be very careful. Red alert, look out, as Paul says, when angry, do not sin, and don't let the sun go down in your anger. Don't dwell on that because it can only lead to bad things. Hope this was helpful. If you have questions, if you have any scenarios you want to run by, hey, what about this? Please let me know. Happy to talk through that. It's a tough thing because, again, we all experience anger, but too easily as Christians we can just kind of take the attitude of the world that anger is fine, it's good, it's right, you should be angry about things. But Scripture says, wait, hold up, Christians, be careful about that. And even the couple passages that seem to make room for some anger are still very warning and telling when it comes to the dangers of anger in our life. So we want to be people who are motivated by other more positive virtues rather than motivated and moved on by anger. All right, hope this was helpful. If you have a topic, you have a question, you have a theme, you would like to see tackled on one of these, there's a link in the description. Looking forward to talking to you real soon. Have a great day.